So that's a little bit about those three. Now we get to the theoretical framework. That's also going to be a part of my research. So what is a theoretical framework? Well, it's a way of really thinking about a phenomenon. And for an example, what is a theoretical framework? We'll look at a traffic light. So imagine two researchers happen to pull up to a yellow traffic light. They're driving down the road. One is a physical science researcher. The other is a social science researcher. So the physical science researcher might be thinking about Maxwell's equation. That's her theoretical framework. She's thinking about that light saying, okay, what kind of a question can I come up with using this framework, looking at this yellow light? And she might say, well, what's the average wavelength of light coming from a yellow traffic light? And she could use a spectrometer and look at the data, and the quantitative data will say, well, it's about 580 nanometers. So she used the theoretical framework to design her question and also to analyze her answer as well. Now, a social science researcher approaching that same traffic light, those same photons of light, that same spectrum, going to ask maybe, when light turns yellow, why does some drivers speed up? Why does some slow down? And why does some stop? Theoretical framework that researcher might use might be choice theory, which looks at things like survival, love, power, freedom, fun. Those ideas might be used to frame the question and analyze the data. Or another example of a theoretical framework in the social sciences might be Maxwell's equation, Maslow's hierarchy, very different. So Maslow's hierarchy is going to be looking at physiological needs, safety needs, belonging. And then those ideas are going to be used to help design the question and analyze the data. So qualitative interviews use coding and analyzing. And when you're doing qualitative research, you're again looking for those patterns, looking for some kind of patterns. And then you're going to use that theoretical framework to, again, come up with your questions and also to analyze the answers and look at through that framework to kind of see how those, what makes sense, what is making sense out of these answers. Now, there's also one other thing I want to touch on briefly. It's called phenomenological. In this approach, you don't use a theoretical framework at all. You're basically using what's called grounded theory, and you're just basically interviewing people and seeing what kind of a theory emerges out of this. So just one other thing about that. So social sciences can also be quantitative. They're not excluded to just qualitative research. Quantitative research can be done too, even using the hierarchy model here, where you could use a Likert scale. The reason I speeded up, I was going home to see my family, agree, disagree. So you're just going to get numbers for your data there. So you can be quantitative as well, doing social science research. So what is a theoretical framework? What does it do? It provides the researcher with a narrow scope to focus on specific variables while defining a specific viewpoint that will be used basically for analyzing and interpreting the data. So the theoretical framework also plays an important part of my research. And it's important for a researcher doing this type of research to let the reader know what the theoretical framework is. You don't want to conceal that. You want to let the readers know this is the angle I'm coming from. It helps the reader to make a critical assessment of the study, and it needs to be explicit. So I'm going to be explicit. My theoretical framework is tribal critical race theory. This was a framework developed by Dr. Brayboy, who is a Lumbee tribal member, and it's a scholarly framework based on logically developed concepts that interrogate settler colonial narratives, and it's attentive to tribal community needs. So there are 9 tenets, and I'm not going to go through, because of time, I'm not going to go through all 9 tenets. Dr. Brayboy himself says that the first tenet really runs through all of them, and that is colonization is endemic to society. What does that mean? What is that going with? So first tenet. So it basically says, and this is pretty straightforward, American, European knowledge, thinking, economic structures, and power structures dominate and frame present-day society. It's the way that most Americans view the world. It's an unquestioned ideology, but it also marginalizes the philosophies and worldviews and languages of indigenous people, implying that they are more archaic or irrelevant because of this more dominant view. So Dr. Lumuwaima says this, and this one really kind of this quote jumped out at me. She said, "We must examine the historic legacies of colonial education that may have created or contributed to the idea of Indian silence." What kind of historical legacies are we talking about here? Well, since 1493, when Columbus came in with his 1,200 men and his 15 ships here on St. Croix, scientific inventories began to rename things, rename places, rename plants, rename rocks, animals, mountains, rivers, and even people. Western scientific processes legally justified oppression and the removal of indigenous people. Western mainstream education justified and reinforced colonial narratives with scientific and historical propaganda for the reproduction and training of young minds. So we basically came in and we named all these different things, and then we justified it through our educational approach, a Western approach with settler colonialism. So when I first thought about this, I was thinking, well, this doesn't happen very much today, but present in the past. So application, how is this theoretical framework going to be applied? The study will do more than simply analyze and organize the interview data. My goal is to recognize broader concepts and perspectives that will better inform the study. And that's with that theoretical framework being the lens that I view the data through. Fifth tenet of tribal critical race theory, the concept of culture, knowledge, and power take on new meaning when examined through an indigenous lens. That's a lot there. So tribal crit basically offers alternative ways of understanding the concepts of culture, power, and knowledge. And when you think about environmental education, different ways of viewing it, Barnhart and Quangley say that environmental education has existed for thousands of years, and it continues to be shared intergenerationally by indigenous people whose knowledge of place and intimate relationship with land are reflected through millennia of cultural survival. So there already are ways of looking at the environment, traditional ecological knowledge that exists, but it has often been pushed to the side. So colonial assumptions become more visible when they're evaluated through a critical lens. Loma Waima again reminds us that as long as the stereotypical ideas are accepted as natural facts, this is the way it is, they will never be scrutinized or analyzed or revised. They will continue to be dominating influences in the training of young minds. That's the concern. So cultural erasure is really easy to think about it. All you have to do is come in with your Western perspectives and just teach, just do what you've always done. And nothing is being really critically looked at. You only need to teach from the default mainstream colonial perspective as a park ranger. So that's fairly easy to do. So when one does this, what might be happening is focusing on certain topics while ignoring others. And quite often you hear, and I did it myself quite a bit, was say, well, the reason that you can do this or do that and want to do this is because of the economic benefits that come from doing all these different things. But that's not necessarily the only way to be looking at this. Now, Dr. Grayboy also talks about policies that really are, this one really is very contrary to a lot of mainstream perspectives. Government policies and educational policies toward Indigenous people are intimately linked around the problematic goal of assimilation. That's sort of number 6. But these different philosophies and beliefs and traditions and visions for the future, as the number 7 talks about, these lived realities are a way of looking at the world that has been very contrary to settler colonialism. And the example that I'd like to bring out is the Dawes Act, the idea where the government, US government, as an assimilation tool, basically said, we're going to divide the land up now into parcels. So every individual family gets their own piece of land. And from a Western perspective, that might sound like a really good thing. But from a tribal perspective, this is very contrary. Burghardt brings out argues to the idea, instead of Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am, is we are, therefore I am. Most indigenous people that are tribal that I've met, they introduce themselves as a tribe first and then as an individual. And again, that's something in my reflective, as I'm thinking about myself my reflexiveness, I have to ask myself, this is something I've taken for granted, but this is not the only way to view the world. We are, therefore I am, would be a more appropriate way of looking at that idea from a tribal perspective. So let's go back to, well, what are we talking about here? We're talking about theoretical frameworks. And according to Cresswell, theoretical lens becomes an advocacy perspective that shapes the type of questions asked, informs how the data is collected, and calls for action and change. So that's the theoretical framework. That's what I'm using in my research, tribal crit. Now we're going to move to the last section of this discussion, and this is really about maybe the history of tribal, well, not really the history of tribal crit, but the story of critical thinking, critical theory, and how this has sort of evolved. And as I go forward with this, the answer to the last question really is the whole thing from here on out. So it's all kind of connected together. We think about history, when we think about changes, ways of thinking, and we think about maybe questioning commonly thought of views. So two big words jump out at me, critical and race here. Critical theory, critical race theory. So critical theory, I go back to the Greeks. Plato reminds us of Socrates, who basically critiqued the idea of multiple gods. He was accused of basically corrupting the morals of young people by bringing all this stuff out that the gods don't exist. And he was, of course, where he ended up. Then you got the allegory of the cave, which is even a better example. These people are all sitting in a room in a cave. All they see are shadows, but they don't know that they're shadows. And one person is let out of the cave. He sees that these things are actually, there are other things that are actually real. They're not shadows. Comes back down to the cave and tries to tell people, well, this is what I saw out there. There's a different way of looking at reality. And he wasn't very well accepted in that story as well. But it was the idea of critical thinking. The other part of this is race. Race really, in a lot of ways, I found goes a lot back to, again, to the Greeks. You can trace it back in other places, but the Greeks jump out in my Western perspective. Pliny talks about human superiority as being like metals, pure metals. Mixing heritage was an indication of inferiority, like bronze. And the inferior metals was then considered to be synonymous with labor, hard labor, and slavery. Athenian law was basically about maintaining that purity of the metals of the different people. So we skip ahead to the Renaissance, and here we have the Bible basically justifying things like slavery. Now we have the Enlightenment that provides new scientific justifications, and these justifications are considered to be objective. So they're really unquestioned. You can't really question some objective perspective. But with that came pseudoscience, social Darwinism, and a lot of this did lead to the justification of subjugation. The Enlightenment scientific positivist view also started to exclude and marginalize other ways of knowing. So there's the scientific method, that's the only way to know things. Well, maybe there were other ways of knowing that might not need mathematics, because is math actually, does nature have to follow math? Does nature have to be perceived through math, or is math just another construct of the human mind? That would be one discussion. But more or less, we're talking about, again, the exclusion, marginalization of other ways of knowing as the Enlightenment moves forward. With this comes the idea of categorizing humans into different groups. Many indigenous people and tribes became almost human, and then lands could be taken from those people because they weren't people any longer. And when we talk about thinking about different stories and how we tell our history, most of us, I grew up knowing 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. When I moved here to St. Croix, I learned about, and that's the picture on the bottom there, but on the picture at the top, that is Cape of the Arrows. And this is where in 1493, Columbus came in with 1,200 men, 15 ships, and the first battle between indigenous people and Columbus took place. It all basically comes back to historical perspectives. How are you viewing the history? What story are you telling? What story are you leaving out? Most civilizations, tribes, and people were, again, legally cataloged by Western science into these things almost human. So the Enlightenment's concept of race, it continued to be defined by science and religion as the rise of imperialism progressed. Pseudoscience, social Darwinism began to replace many religious beliefs about race. And low latitude people and indigenous cultures will become more enslaved and oppressed as the rapid expanse of global trade empowered the new economic systems, often rooted in capitalism. So now we are moving forward through time. We've got manifest destiny starting to show up, removal of indigenous people. Now we're blending use of the Bible with Descartes' mechanistic view. So now the Enlightenment idea is also mixing with biblical thoughts and popular opinion. Locke's view is that, well, God's plan is for us to make the land useful. And if we're not making it useful, then we're not following God's plan. Again, that idea of manifest destiny. And something that you don't hear a lot about, but just eugenics. Eugenics starts to come up again. Using science, skull sizes, nose shapes. These become the measures of social stratification in some places. And again, this is just a blending of this Enlightenment idea with subjectivity and also with biblical views. So you might be saying right now, why is he going into all this history? Why all this history? Well, the leaders of critical theory, critical race theory, all seem to come back to history. Webb Du Bois says education requires a critical knowledge of the past. Bell, he says that they both say counter narratives of history are important. Historical critique make visible what basically were biases and norms in the past. Horkheimer says that critical theory is a corrective of history, confronting historical context, measuring them against the social backdrop from which they emanated. And Brayboy also, with Tribal Crit, offers an alternative ways of understanding concept of culture, knowledge, and power. So we're talking about how do you view history? And you might say, well, history is just the same. History is history. How could there be different views of it? Now, how many of you see a bird, a duck in this picture? Take a second. Any of you see a rabbit? Okay, you see a bird or a rabbit?
I saw the duck first.
The duck first, and you see the rabbit now?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so again, you could take something and just depending on how you're viewing it, what you're bringing along with you, that's going to help, or that's going to basically help you decide what is reality. Now, Du Bois was one of these early thinkers, and I would say a forerunner of critical theory. He developed an interpretive social ontological perspective. This early graduate of Harvard. He says education requires critical knowledge of the past, a critical knowledge of African and U.S. history. He argued that history conceived in white supremacist capitalist contexts are often an ideological deception. He asked his contemporaries to reverse the gaze, and I love that statement. The idea where he's basically asked to go out and study a community of individuals that are fairly low income, and these are a community of people of color. And he's like, well, wait a minute, we're not going to figure out how these people are in this situation, why they're in this situation by looking at that. We need to turn our gaze around and look at the mainstream society and see what are they actually doing to keep these people oppressed here. Very different way of looking at things in the early 1800s and 1900s. Well, as time kind of marches on, we have World War I, again, low latitude people and indigenous cultures, again, becoming victims of oppression. And this idea of World War I, people from India quite often were dragged to France and had to fight in World War I. Again, an accelerated international process of human exploitation. Then World War II rolls along, and we have, again, the ability to manipulate popular opinion regarding race becomes more and more efficient. Racism and popular opinion culminates with the Nazi Party, and the Nazis, again, revised historical narratives and racial narratives. Against these points of view, started to rise another voice in Germany, and that was the Frankfurt School. Critical theory was really coined with the Frankfurt School, and they basically were saying economic and social class is an approach. Basically, we're talking about how are we looking at these things? How are we looking at economic and social class? And they wanted to confront social problems going on at that current age. This school called the Frankfurt School. They focused on human suffering and economic conditions producing suffering. What did these critical theorists come up with? They said, well, critical theory, or with critical theory, we're going to be critical of the mechanistic view of nature and society. Just using quantitative knowledge, assuming that it supersedes all other ways of knowing. Critical of positivist approach that reduces phenomenon into numbers, reducing complexity into simple explanations. Critical of knowledge being used to control both nature and people. They recognize the Frankfurt School that the idea of knowing about something meant often that meant you could control that thing. Where many tribal perspectives would be more about, not so much about knowing about nature to control it, but knowing about nature to play a role within it, to be within it and to work within it. So the Frankfurt School starts coming up and they are doing their work. Critical theory, first time the phrase is coined, was in 1937. The majority of these members are in Germany, and so things start to change with the rise of Adolf Hitler. So the ideals of the Frankfurt School: reducing suffering of the oppressed, focusing on the power of nature and the weakness of society. Like also looking for an equitable state of affairs, because that was necessary for the unfolding of humankind's potential. All right, so the Frankfurt School in critical theory, the school decided to pull out of Germany, and they went to Geneva and then to Paris after the rise of Hitler, and eventually moved to the United States. The most amazing document, and I've gotten a bit into this book, Dialectic of the Enlightenment. This was a really interesting paper or book written by Horkheimer and Adorno. Some of the concepts was that humans of the Enlightenment seek to learn from nature, not so much to learn about nature, but how to dominate it, and also how to dominate other humans. The Enlightenment has eradicated the last remnants of its own self-awareness, meaning subjectivity, in my opinion. Eradicated subjectivity. And again, the idea of domination, control of the thing being understood. There's that link between we understand it, now we can control it. If we can't control it, then we really don't understand it. There was a critique of that. It examined the dangers of looking at individuals as if they were numbers. Examines the scientific path towards totalitarianism in Germany and USSR. That's what they were also looking at. And it also explored the idea and concerns about totalitarianism crossing over into capitalist societies. So in the 1930s to the 1970s, and we're kind of winding down here, positivism was continuing to go on, and challenges were critical theory basically continued to challenge those views. You would hear voices like John Dewey, who said critical theory is important and necessary, reflexive thinking. Aldo Leopold, who came up with the land ethic, who had empathy, the green fire, the idea where you can't, the accepted idea was remove all the predators and then you'll have more prey, more things to hunt. He was critical of that idea. Rachel Carson, the common view at the time was to spray everything with DDT. Rachel Carson had a critical approach that said, no, this is maybe not the best way to do this, and she used scientific methods to prove that. And then also we have environmental injustices happening at the same time in the 1970s, 60s, and even today, there's an article about more EPA air quality monitors in white neighborhoods than in non-white neighborhoods. So time continues forward, and I am kind of winding down. I know we're closing on the clock here. Critical legal study starts to emerge. And the idea was, well, white supremacy and subordination of color needs to be investigated. Groups are competing for power, and this competition is based a lot on wealth, race, and gender. Roberto Unger brings out the idea that dominant groups have constructed laws and instruments of power over the power of the people they dominate. And the categories we use to describe these people were actually created a lot by the people who were in power and use those terms to dominate. Critical legal studies posits that traditional legal discourses are neither neutral nor sufficient to overcome the effects of centuries of racial oppression. Also, critical race feminism started to raise the concern that voices of Black women and tribal women had not been heard. Finally, we come to critical race theory. Now we have Derek Bell in the 1980s and 90s. Derek Bell used storytelling and historical context to demonstrate case law. He was a lawyer. He worked with the Department of Justice, but because they asked him to resign from the NAACP, he resigned from the Department of Justice. He was a Harvard professor, and he is the one who first coined the phrase, as far as I can tell, critical race theory. He used people like Geneva Crenshaw, not a real person. She was an imaginary person that basically he put into different places. Here, she was standing in front of constitutional delegates explaining all the horrible things that are going to happen in the United States if they don't get rid of slavery and these oppressions that are going on. So he used a lot of interesting approaches using stories. Delgado, I love this quote. He said, "I have no real framework for vocabulary to describe what I believe was racism. I had been socialized not to name it explicitly." And that's where critical race theory helps to kind of get into that and find out, well, what are we talking about? Why have we not talked about it before? It has been developed as a critique of color blindness. And to kind of go a little bit more into that, an idea that basically, well, let's just jump ahead because we're running down on time. The idea of color blindness is that it basically allows many groups to say, I am not responsible for the hardships that people of color are facing daily because of this color blindness. It empowers the status quo. Thank you. Just a couple of tenets here of critical race theory. Again, there's an awful lot here we're covering. Racism is just not some random isolated act of individuals behaving badly. It is the normal way of things in US society. So the first tenet says, well, racism is the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience for most people of color. And again, color blindness, this idea, it's confronting color blindness, this idea color blindness empowers the status quo to feel good and have a clear conscience as they maintain the majority of wealth and power in society. So it's recognizing this. And then the second tenet that Bell mentions is convergence. And this idea that a lot of times when white people do things, sometimes they do things that look like it's for the good of everybody, but it might actually be in the interest of that dominant group. The example that he gives was when former Arizona governor basically got rid of Martin Luther King's holiday because it was too expensive. Then when all the conventions and everybody said, well, then we're not coming to Arizona, loss of millions of dollars, he turned around and said, no, okay, we're going to have that. So it wasn't because of, for the benefit of creating more better ways of looking at things and being more empathetic. It was about money. It was about doing what was best for the dominant group. Race is a social construct. Again, the idea that race is something that's actually tangible has been refuted again and again. But judicial policies between the 1860s and 1960s openly accepted that idea that race exists. It's been refuted genetically through genetic studies, and people like Huxley realized that, well, the courts are going to have trouble back in the day deciding, well, who's this race and who's that race. So he came up with something that's called the one-drop rule. Again, these are different elements of history that critical race theory recognizes and confronts. So what do I view critical race theory as in critical theory? I think it challenges researchers to question the positivist assumptions that inaccurately claim scientific neutrality in all cases. And it encourages reflexivity, so researchers might question their own biases and worldviews. And as a concluding slide, just again, a reminder of these different things we've talked about. And again, I see critical theory and critical race theory as seeing things from another person's point of view. And critical theory really, in a lot of ways, is just about empathy as well. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.